In episode 84, titled SMOTE and Resampling, When Synthetic Examples Help or Harm, we focus on a tempting solution to an irritating problem, when the rare class is so underrepresented that the model struggles to learn it, it feels natural to make more positives. Resampling can help, but it can also create fake confidence, where evaluation looks strong and deployment disappoints because the training signal no longer matches reality. This episode is about learning to recognize when synthetic examples improve learning versus when they simply decorate the dataset with artifacts. The exam cares about boundaries and integrity, meaning when resampling is appropriate, how it changes what the model learns, and how it can quietly invalidate evaluation. If you walk away with one habit, it is that resampling is a tool for training, not a shortcut for credibility, and it must be handled with discipline. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the DataX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at SMOTE in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. SMOTE, which stands for Synthetic Minority Oversampling Technique, creates synthetic minority class examples by interpolating between existing minority examples that are near each other in feature space. Instead of duplicating the same rare examples again and again, it selects a minority example, finds one or more of its nearest minority neighbors, and generates a new point somewhere along the line segment between them. The intuition is that if two minority points are both valid, points between them are often plausible minority points as well, especially when the minority class occupies a coherent region of the space. This can make the classifier's job easier because the minority region becomes denser and the model sees more variation than it would from simple duplication. The word synthetic is important because these new points are not observed events, and treating them as if they are real can lead to the wrong conclusions if you forget why they were created. SMOTE tends to be most useful when the minority class is small but structured, meaning the minority examples reflect a genuine pattern that is undersampled rather than a scattered collection of unrelated edge cases. In such settings, the problem is not that the minority class is incoherent, but that you do not have enough samples to represent its shape well enough for the model to learn a stable boundary. Interpolating between neighbors can fill gaps and encourage the learner to treat that region as a continuous class rather than as isolated points that might be treated as noise. This is especially relevant when features are numeric and represent a meaningful geometry, because interpolation preserves continuity in a way that makes sense. When the minority class has a consistent cluster-like shape, SMOTE can reduce overfitting to a handful of rare examples by spreading the training signal more evenly within that region. The benefit is not that you invented new truth, but that you used the information you already had more effectively. The same logic can fail when classes overlap heavily and the boundary is messy, because interpolation can create synthetic examples that land in ambiguous territory. If the minority class points are intermingled with majority class points, then a line between two minority neighbors can pass through regions that are actually dominated by the majority class. In that case, SMOTE may generate synthetic positives that are not representative of real positives, effectively teaching the model that certain majority-like patterns should be labeled as minority. This can increase false positives, reduce precision, and create a brittle decision surface that looks reasonable in training but fails in the real distribution. Overlap is common in security telemetry, where benign and malicious behaviors share many features, and the minority class often lives near the boundary rather than in a clean cluster. In those cases, SMOTE can blur the boundary instead of clarifying it, and the help becomes harm by injecting mislabeled ambiguity into training. Recognizing overlap is therefore not a minor detail. It is a prerequisite to choosing synthetic generation responsibly. The most important operational rule is to never apply SMOTE before splitting your data into training and validation, because doing so causes leakage and inflates performance. When you generate synthetic samples from the full dataset, you are using information from what should have been held out validation examples to create training examples. Even worse, synthetic samples can be extremely close in feature space to the original validation points they were derived from, which means the model effectively trains on near copies of the data it will later be evaluated on. That breaks the independence assumption that makes validation meaningful, and it produces scores that are not an estimate of generalization, but a measure of how well your leakage pipeline can fool you. The safe pattern is split first, then resample only within the training portion, and then evaluate on untouched validation data. If you are using cross-validation, this means resampling inside each fold's training split, not once globally. Comparing SMOTE to simple oversampling clarifies why synthetic generation exists in the first place, because simple oversampling is duplication rather than interpolation. With oversampling by duplication, you repeat minority examples until the class counts are more balanced, which increases the minority class presence without creating new points. The upside is that duplication does not invent feature values, so you are not creating synthetic patterns that might be unrealistic, and the process is straightforward. The downside is that duplication can encourage the model to memorize those repeated examples, especially with flexible learners, because the training set now contains exact repeats that reinforce specific points rather than broadening the minority region. SMOTE tries to address that by adding diversity within the minority class region, making the learner less likely to fixate on a few repeated points. Neither approach is universally superior, because the right choice depends on whether the minority class needs more density around real points or more variety within a structured region. Undersampling is the other side of resampling, and it can be appropriate when the majority class overwhelms compute or makes training inefficient without adding proportional learning value. If you have millions of majority examples and only a few thousand minority examples, training on every majority example may be unnecessary, especially if many majority points are redundant or nearly identical. Undersampling reduces the size of the majority class by selecting a subset, which speeds training and can rebalance the class distribution the model experiences. The risk is that you can throw away important majority variations, including rare majority patterns that are easily confused with the minority class, which can increase false positives. If you undersample naively, you might remove the very hard negatives the model needs to learn a clean boundary. Undersampling can be helpful when you combine it with careful evaluation and a strategy that preserves representative majority diversity, but it should never be treated as free balance without cost. Class weights offer an alternative when you are concerned that resampling might distort real prevalence or encourage the model to treat the world as more balanced than it is. With class weights, the dataset stays as observed, but the training objective penalizes minority class errors more heavily, which encourages the model to pay attention to minority examples without changing the sample composition. This can be valuable when prevalence itself is part of the story, such as when predicted probabilities need to align with real base rates for decision-making. Resampling changes the training distribution and can shift the model's implicit prior, while weighting changes the loss landscape without changing what the model sees. Weighting can still increase sensitivity and thus alter the trade-off between false positives and false negatives, but it does so without inventing synthetic feature patterns. In settings where operational metrics depend directly on prevalence, weights can be the more conservative choice, provided you still tune thresholds based on capacity and risk. Choosing among these approaches should be driven by the cost of misses and alerts, because class imbalance is ultimately a decision problem, not just a modeling detail. If the cost of missing a true positive is extreme, you may accept more false positives and use methods that increase minority sensitivity, such as weighting or carefully applied oversampling. If the cost of alerts is high because each alert triggers expensive investigation, you may prioritize precision and be cautious with methods that inflate positive predictions, especially when overlap is heavy. SMOTE can be attractive when the minority class is small and structured, but if it increases false alarms beyond capacity, its benefit becomes irrelevant regardless of validation score. Undersampling can reduce compute and speed iteration, but if it removes the majority patterns that cause false positives, you can end up with a model that looks good in training and produces noisy alerts in deployment. The correct approach is the one that aligns the training adjustment with the real cost structure and the operational constraints of decision-making. Validation should rely on precision recall curves and threshold analysis rather than accuracy alone, because resampling changes the apparent class balance and can make accuracy even less meaningful. Precision recall curves keep focus on the positive class, which is where the value and the pain usually live in imbalanced problems. Threshold analysis is essential because many resampling methods alter score distributions, meaning that a default threshold may produce an alert volume that is unrealistic. If you only report a single threshold and a single number, you are hiding the fact that the model might be usable only in a narrow threshold band. A disciplined evaluation looks at how precision and recall move as the threshold changes and connects that movement to expected workload. When you resample during training, the point is not to win a metric contest, but to make better decisions at a threshold that your operations can actually support. Calibration deserves explicit attention because SMOTE and other resampling methods can distort the interpretation of predicted probabilities. When you change the class distribution in training, you often change the model's implicit view of the base rate, which can shift predicted scores upward or downward in ways that do not match real-world prevalence. A model can remain well-ranked, meaning it still orders cases from most likely positive to least likely positive, while its probabilities become poorly calibrated, meaning the numeric values no longer correspond to true likelihood. That matters when decisions depend on probability thresholds that are interpreted as risk levels, or when downstream systems consume probabilities rather than hard labels. If calibration is distorted, you may see unexpected swings in alert volume when prevalence changes, because the score distribution does not reflect reality. Monitoring calibration is therefore not academic. It is a way to ensure the model's outputs remain meaningful for decision-making after you have manipulated the training distribution. Because resampling affects both training dynamics and operational outcomes, you should document resampling decisions and their expected impact on deployment workload. Documentation is not bureaucracy for its own sake, because without a record, you cannot explain why the model behaves differently after retraining, or why a tuning change caused alert volume to spike. You want to capture what method was used, whether it was oversampling, SMOTE, undersampling, or class weighting, and where it was applied in the evaluation workflow so leakage boundaries are clear. You also want to connect the method to the threshold policy, because training adjustments that increase sensitivity can require threshold adjustments to keep alert volume within capacity. Clear documentation helps teams reason about trade-offs when stakeholders ask why the model is not simply tuned for maximum recall or why a slight metric improvement was rejected. In mature practice, resampling choices are part of the system's decision policy, and they should be treated as such. The anchor memory for episode 84 is split first, then resample, then validate honestly, because that order protects evaluation integrity and prevents fake confidence. Splitting first preserves the independence of validation and test data, ensuring your resampling does not leak information across boundaries. Resampling then becomes a training-only intervention designed to improve learning on the rare class, not an evaluation trick that inflates numbers. Honest validation means using metrics that reflect imbalanced reality, particularly precision recall trade-offs and threshold behavior, and checking calibration so probabilities remain interpretable. This anchor also reminds you that resampling is not a free win because it can change score distributions, alert volume, and the apparent risk signal in ways that matter operationally. If you remember this sequence, you will avoid the most common errors that turn resampling into self-deception. To close episode 84, titled SMOTE and Resampling, when synthetic examples help or harm, choose one resampling method and name its key risk so you can justify it under exam pressure. If you choose SMOTE, the key risk is generating synthetic positives in overlapping regions, which can blur boundaries, inflate false positives, and distort probability calibration if the training distribution no longer matches real prevalence. If you choose simple oversampling by duplication, the key risk is overfitting through memorization, because repeating the same minority examples can cause the model to latch on to idiosyncrasies rather than general patterns. If you choose undersampling, the key risk is discarding informative majority cases, especially hard negatives that the model needs to avoid false alarms, which can make deployment noisy. If you choose class weights, the key risk is shifting the decision surface toward higher sensitivity without a corresponding threshold policy, which can increase alerts beyond capacity if you assume the default threshold still applies. Whatever you choose, the disciplined evaluation plan remains the same. Split first, apply the method only to training, validate with precision, recall, and threshold analysis, and check calibration so your scores mean what you think they mean. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.